Sure. This is I mean, they're all important, but this, and I need to share my screen. No, I don't need to share it because I need it to record what I'm going to write on the board. Okay. So thank you for being like a really exemplary class yesterday during lab. I didn't tell y'all in advance that I was going to be observed because it's more realistic that way. And you all are a really good class anyway, so. And also good for you to get to see Dr. Hutchinson and get to know her a little bit. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're here. I'm kind of frazzled today, and I was thinking about that and like how much I like that word. I don't like the feeling, but the word frazzled. It's kind of like I like that word. Kind of sounds like so maybe you're also feeling kind of frazzled here at midterms and a lot of tests looming, and maybe you feel like your one day of fall break is like at this point just could be studying, but just keep doing the next right thing. Keep doing the next right thing. Try to rest a little, study a little, sleep if you can this weekend. Okay, so last time when we had stopped, we had been talking about all these different definitions of the ways that we can describe diseases. And we had talked about these 4 terms of patterns of diseases occurring. And we have endemic, sporadic, epidemic, and pandemic. These particular definitions will usually end up as multiple choice stuff on this upcoming test. Some of the other ones, like this set also, would be multiple choice type of definitions. The ones that we drew on the gingerbread man and the ones that are coming up next are on a different type of question. And that's the word bank scenario type of question. And we're going to look at some examples of practice questions of that today also to help prepare for next Friday test. So the section that we're going into next is describing not so much where the disease is in somebody's body and not so much the pattern of the location where people are getting it, but how people give it to each other. Like, how do people infect each other? Or what was the thing that infected you with this disease? So maybe we should put that as a qualifier here, like what transmitted this infection to the new person? And there's a lot of definitions that describe that concept of where did this come from and how did you catch it? That's what this set of definitions will have in common. So your OpenStax book depicts this. Is this from your OpenStax book, actually? It could be that this whole section in OpenStax, I don't like how they depict it, and these pictures may actually be from a different book. And a lot of different books tend to put this in a table format, which is not my favorite for teaching. But what I'm going to do is describe, here is a definition, and here's some examples of how that works in real life. So there's a word called reservoir, and sometimes we think of reservoir as like a lake or something, or a big body of water. But in a disease sense, reservoir is talking about some type of place in nature where the pathogen can live long term. And that is like everything on this page is a reservoir. So it can be animals. Like certain diseases, animals carry those. And you can assume that that pathogen is in animals a large part of the time, and animals are a reservoir for where that virus or where that bacterium lives. There are some for which humans are the reservoir. Like we're like a long-term habitat for that pathogen. And then we have places like soil, water, and what I'm gonna call buildings. So they're calling down here the built environment. Those are structures that people create. And when we think of this word reservoir, that's like a source of infection. Could be an animal, could be a person, could be something out in nature or a building where that pathogen or that microbe just kind of lives there a lot of the time. So that's reservoir, first definition. If we are talking about humans, like if humans are the reservoir and humans are going to pass it to other humans, that is going to give us the next set of definitions. So the next couple of pages have to do with, okay, assuming that this pathogen lives in people, how do we then classify groups of people who infect us according to their classification, let's say? So the next set, we're assuming that humans are the source of infection, and how do we describe what type of human gave us that infection? So a lot of times when people are passing infection to each other, the person who has it and is passing it on, they don't really look sick or feel that bad. And we would call them a carrier. So being a carrier of disease means that they are technically infected. So they have the pathogen, they have the microbe multiplying inside them, but they are not really showing many symptoms. So they may kind of feel okay, and they may not look obviously like a sick, infectious person, but they definitely are carrying that and they can spread it to the next person. So we can call carriers, we can classify them in different ways. So the first is that they're not showing any symptoms, or we can say that they're asymptomatic. They appear to be fine. They don't know they're sick. You don't know that they're sick. They're asymptomatic. So this definition is fine for asymptomatic. And a lot of diseases that spread very effectively are spreading effectively because the person that has it doesn't know that they have it. STDs tend to be this way, unfortunately. It's not the only ones, but these sexually transmitted infections, a lot of times the person that is infected, they don't have any symptoms and they don't know that they have it. And so they're passing it on, and then it becomes a very widespread infection. I feel like people learn so much about that concept in high school that we're not gonna dwell on that, but that's an example. A second set of people who are carriers, they don't show any symptoms, but the reason that they don't show any symptoms is that they are in the incubation or prodromal period of their infection. And we would call those incubating carriers. And you might think, well, like, there's no practical difference between these groups. The practical difference would be that this set of people, they're gonna have symptoms in the next few days, let's say. This group of people are gonna be kind of long-term not showing symptoms. So this group gonna appear fine long-term. This group is about to get to feel sick, they just don't know it yet. So that we would call them incubating carriers. Convalescent carriers are recovering and they will say things like, I am feeling okay, but they actually are still infectious. They would say things like, yeah, I feel better, I'm well enough to go to work. I can go about my usual activities now because I'm recovering. They actually still could be infectious. So in our society, the rules that we have about like, when can you go back to work? When can you go back to school? When can your child return to daycare? Like, that's the big, like, need them to get back into daycare. What's the rule about that? You don't have kids. Good. Start saying, you don't have kids, you don't know this rule. 24 hours fever free. Or 24 hours without symptoms. And the reason that we have that general rule is to try to pick out, like, when would most people not be infectious anymore? And try to have some general guideline for people, like, okay, if you felt good for 24 hours and you haven't had a fever, you're probably not infectious. Instead of trying to come up with a specific rule for every specific infection. But all of these, the person's gonna feel pretty good, but they technically are infectious. Okay, so even still more types of carriers. Someone who is a chronic carrier, we would classify them as they are infected with a long-term microbe that takes a long time to be cured from. Awkward phrasing. And you could kind of describe that as you have an infection that takes forever to get over, actually. You're chronically infected with tuberculosis, you are chronically infected with typhoid. People that have hepatitis is kind of a nearly chronic long-term infection. And for those groups of people, for them, it's like, do I really not go to work for 3 months? Like, that's a big economic issue for them. And maybe they feel like they can't really get completely recovered before they go out and do the things that they need to do. So we would call them chronic carriers. There are way too many food service workers that are chronic carriers of hepatitis and they don't really know it. And could be infecting, people that eat the food that they make, and that's why they're showing that cartoon for chronic carrier. And then the other one that is different from those others is a passive carrier. This one's special. A passive carrier is not actually infected themselves. And they are spreading the microbe because it is on them. Or it's on their glove, or it's on their clothing, or it's on their items that they're carrying around from place to place. It's not in their body. It is just on the surface of them. The pathogen is not leaving their portal of exit, it's just on the stuff that is attached to them. So they're showing here the example. A person who is bringing the food to the patient. Is that food? Is that a bedpan? I can't even tell what that is. They're carrying something and it's got infectious microbe on it. And they pick it up from this patient and it's on the tray or whatever that is. And then if it gets on their hand and then they go and then they treat the next patient, she is not infected, but she has moved the pathogen from this patient to this patient. And we would say that she is the passive carrier. Or he, if that's a mullet. I feel like it's a woman. They are the passive carrier and they're not infected. They're not going to get sick, but they have moved something from patient 1 to patient 2. And this thing, like when you start working in the hospital and you have to practice infection control, and there's going to be an infection control officer where you work and everybody hates them because they are like, are you using your PPE? Did you do this right? Did you do that right? And it's annoying, but they're trying to prevent passive carrier of disease between patients that are already sick with something else. Not infecting you, you're just passing it in between people. So another way that we can classify infections is if there is an animal involved in the transmission process. At any point, we call that type of infection zoonotic or zoonotic, like animals in a zoo, zoonotic infection. And this could be because you literally got the disease from an animal, or because you got it from an insect bite, but in some way an animal was involved with you getting that infection. We call that zoonotic. And there's tons of examples of that. And your all's parasite presentations are going to have specific examples of that. So on this slide, I'm not interested in you all knowing the details on the chart, but just what it means to be a zoonotic infection. And most of these do not spread directly person to person. Like there's some animal in between in the infection process. Like you can't get rabies from another person. You cannot catch trichinosis from another person. So not everything that a person is infected with is directly transmissible to the next person without transmitting through some animal first. We would call those zoonotic infections. So another way that we can classify infections is if it went person to person. If the infection did transmit between people, how did it do that? Was it direct transmission or was it indirect transmission? So we're going to first talk about the direct transmission or direct contact transmission. And for me, when I think about is it direct or is it indirect? Direct contact transmission involves some type of touching person to person, generally. And there is some type of fluid exchange in some way. In some way. So kissing a baby and giving it RSV, something like that, respiratory syncytial virus, that would be a direct transmission. Because like you get a little bit of saliva on them and then they're just messy babies and it gets in their mouth or gets in their nose and they transmit it that way. These two, what the fluids are on their hands could be different. And where their hand goes next could be different. But they're touching one of their body fluid is on their hand, and their hand is going to transmit it, like in your eye. Pink eye can spread that way, or pick your nose, or bite your nails. And so that's a way for direct transmission to happen, even if they're not kissing each other or breathing directly on each other, something like that. Another thing that would fall into this category, sharing a drink, like drinking out of the same container. Kissing, sexual contact is definitely direct and fluid to fluid in some way. Sneeze, cough, vomit. Food directly like on. So if your child sneezes directly in your face and you cannot avoid it, and then you just breathe in directly, that's kind of the same thing as kissing them. Or if you're doing nursing practice and the patient throws up on you, it's probably gonna happen sometime. Like that could become direct contact if you don't immediately take precautions. So it's kind of like a fluid to fluid. It doesn't have to go directly, but it's like the fluids did not dry out in between. That's direct contact. Direct contact, both of these have to do with methods of person to person contact. And most direct contact is considered horizontal. disease transmission. That one is easier to understand. So it's person to person. And it doesn't rely on maternal to child relationship. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So those things that I was just talking about, like your child coughs in your face, or you arm wrestle and he picks his nose and he caught something from you, or you share a drink, or things like that. Those are all horizontal, person to person. But if the disease was transmitted in some way because of the parent-child relationship, like it went through the sperm, I'm like, that is so rare. That almost never happens. Like the sperm carries an infectious disease that infects the child. Like that basically never happens. So realistically, vertical transmission is from mom to child, and it depends on the mom-child relationship. Like they caught it through breastfeeding, or they caught it because her placenta was infected with HIV, and then the child got it. It has to do with the genetic relationship between mother and child. But if I'm changing like a disgusting poop diaper of my child, and I accidentally infect myself with that, that is not, sorry, that's not vertical, that's still horizontal. So vertical is like your genetic relationship, or you being the mother and you like reproductively or breast milk or it passed on that way. That's vertical. Vertical is not very common. Horizontal is really common. Okay, so if diseases don't spread by direct contact between people, they're spreading by indirect. So indirect transmission, it is person to person in some manner that is not relying on wet fluid exchange. It is still spreading between people, but there's more distance involved and there's more time involved, and it's not wet fluid to wet fluid. We call that indirect. If insects transmit diseases between people, that's called vector transmission, and that's indirect. Like the insect may bite someone and pick up a parasite from their blood and then fly around for 7 days and then go bite another person and indirectly transmit it to them. And those two people were never around each other. Never around each other. Or people left infectious material on an object. And we call that a fomite. It's a weird word. How about fomite transmission? So a fomite is a non-living object that can have microbes, let's say infectious microbes on the surface. And they may stay there for a while until the next person comes along and grabs it and they get microbes on it. And then they scratch their eye or bite their nails or pick their nose or whatever. And that transmits the microbe to them. So things like marker is a fomite. Doorknob is a fomite. Maybe toilet seat. Fomite. Most of the stuff that you all swab day one, those are fomites, like steering wheel, purse, phone. One person went and swabbed somebody else's neck or something. That's not a fomite, that would be direct transmission. Yeah. And then included in this category is one of the grossest but most common routes of transmission, which is called, whoops, I got that backward. Either the oral fecal route. And so feces have a huge amount of bacteria. All those ones that we talked about yesterday in lab that are gram negative, those could be gut bacteria and those could be in feces. And so having fecal material, even a little bit amount on your hand, and then transferring to food, and it's just kind of sitting in the food, and then people eat the food, that is technically considered fecal oral transmission. And that's indirect as well. So that has to do more with food safety and hand hygiene and preventing infection in that way. And then here's again examples of fomite. So like shower floor, that's a fomite. Needles in medical care, that's a fomite. Some object that's not living. If disease transmits through vehicle, you might think, what is the difference between a vehicle and a fomite? Vehicle tends to get ingested or breathed in. So a fomite is something that you touch it, and then your hands transmit it to the next place. A vehicle tends to be directly ingested or breathed in. So this would include food is a vehicle, air, water. So if you drink contaminated water and you get sick from it, water was a vehicle. And you were indirectly infected from the water. Soil. This is usually like little kids playing in dirt. Don't want to wash their hands. I don't get why washing hands is so horrible to little kids, but it is. And then they accidentally eat some dirt. Who knows what was in it? I have a story to tell y'all. If you grew up in Bristol or you lived here more than 3 years ago, there used to be this Taco Bell, the old Taco Bell out on West State Street on the way to the hospital. And now there's a new one and it's all nice and clean and stuff, but the old one was old. You know what I'm talking about, that one. So we like Taco Bell. We would go to that one and we would go when the boys were really little. And our youngest son, I remember going there and he was like this tall, so he was probably 2 or 3. He could walk into the bathroom like, let's go. And I had his hands up there trying to wash them. He's so small. This is washing them. Like kind of like struggling with me because he didn't wash his hands. And washing his hands, I look down, he's licking the sink while we're washing his hands. I'm like, this is the most pointless thing ever. Like, you are licking a nasty Taco Bell sink. And it was one of those single stall restrooms, so sink wasn't even separate from the toilet. There he is, he's licking the sink while I'm washing his hands. But we have immune systems. So that's coming in the next section. Like, he did not immediately get sick from that, which is surprising. His whatever's on the sink, immune system fought it off that week. The sink is a fomite. It can have a lot of infectious material on it. There you go. The fact that most of the time we are not sick is pretty amazing and awesome. And then, so yeah, this is the last on this vector. Vector. A vector transmission is usually an insect or arthropod, like a tick or a spider or something like that, but technically not an insect. And that insect or tick or spider is going to move infectious microbes into a host, like a person or a dog or whatever. So these vectors are passing you the infection, but technically they're not the problem. It's what's inside of their saliva or inside their body that they're passing to you. And we call that vector transmission. So mosquitoes are vectors, ticks are vectors. Certain other types of insects that can bite you, like a flea, can be a vector. Those of you that have for your disease, your parasite presentation, if you have Rocky Mountain spotted fever or Lyme disease, or any other one where like an insect gives it to you, but the real problem is a bacteria, or the real problem is a protozoan, like malaria, that causes malaria. The insect is involved, but it's something else that's infecting you. The insect or the tick is the vector that passed it to you, but they're actually not the problem. It's what's growing inside you from that transmission. That's what's the problem is. So, yeah. Okay, so what I want to do now is take a look at practice questions. We've got some practice questions that are in Canvas. And those are really representing a whole page of test question that will come up on next Friday's test. So we're going to kind of take some time to look at these and practice them and talk about how that section will work. Here we go. Infection scenarios, practice questions. Oops. And this is, I like to do this more than just have people memorize definitions and write them down, because that is boring. And I don't think that that really sticks with you so much. So I do it this way. So the way this will work is on the test and on these practice questions, you have a word bank of types of infections that we could use to describe what's going on with a person. And then you have scenarios that describe, this is the situation. Which of these words would you pick out that actually describe this? And it's a choose all that apply. And so it's about that many definitions, and then about, I've given you all like way more on the practice questions than you would have on the test. So this is like 2 tests worth. And so the way that I grade this is you have maybe 3 or 4, probably 4 scenarios on the test. And I will make a key, and if there's 30, let's say there's like 32 correct answers on that page, if you've got 24, that's fine. So it's not that you have to get every single thing totally correct. If you've got more than 24, they become bonus. So that can be good. I like this type of question. It's helpful in many ways. So let's take a look at the first 2 or 3 of these. I'm probably just going to only do this the rest of the class, and we'll be a little bit technically behind, but either think about these for yourself or talk about them in a group and see what you can pick out in this scenario, which of these words would correctly describe that. So work on the first 2 to start with. First 2 scenarios. I'm quickly going to turn off the recording because recording this part of class is not that helpful. So put that back up.